Okay, we are recording. All right, well, welcome everyone. So see you in September, what you need to know to help your child return to school. So sit back, relax, get ready to listen and learn. But first, a very special thank you tonight to Dr. Stephanie Townsend, Director of Research and Analytics for ROC the Future, to Dr. L.J. Shipley, Professor of Clinical Pediatrics and Vice Chair for Population and Behavioral Health at Golisano Children's Hospital and at University of Rochester Medical Center. Thank you to Suzanne Luce, social worker for Pittsford Youth Services, who also works at Barker and Thornell. Thank you to Elizabeth Devaney, Director of Whole Child Connection at the Children's Institute. And to Katie McGowan, Behavioral Specialist, and Dave Pascarella, Social Worker for Pittsford Central School District. And not mentioned on here, but thank you to Dr. Pat Van Brogen, and Director of Student Services, and to Greta Johnston, Student Services Specialist for Pittsford Central School District, for all of their help in making this happen tonight. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Stephanie Townsend, also a Pittsford parent, to tell us more about the impact of the pandemic on academics and social emotional learning. So let me.
Thank you so much, Kim. It really is such a pleasure to be here tonight. I get to do my work most often in the city of Rochester. So to be able to come and speak on behalf of children here in Pittsford, where I live and raise my child, is just such a pleasure tonight. I probably don't need to remind anyone that in March of 2020, Pittsford Schools shifted overnight to remote learning. And what was initially hoped to be a short-term situation became long-term. And that caused a lot of upheaval for children, for families, and for the schools. Despite the truly heroic efforts and collaborations, education for our children was impacted. Some children have actually thrived in this environment. Others have been sort of feeling stuck in a holding pattern of just getting through it. For most of our children, I think it's probably been a combination of both thriving and stress. The fact is, children are resilient, but they have all been impacted in different ways. So we can go to the next slide to look a little bit at some of the academic impacts that we are starting to see as researchers. So as the Director of Research and Analytics at ROC the Future, I've been monitoring the emerging research on what is called learning loss due to the pandemic. Now, most of that research is on children in grades 3 through 8. And here's, in really plain language, what we think we know so far. Initially, there was a lot of concern about losses in reading, especially for elementary school age children. But what we're seeing is that those academic impacts are much less than we first expected. And I think in Pittsford, we can be reassured that they're even less, because our elementary school children most of them have been in school 4.5 days a week. While some have been learning remotely, but those who have been remote have been able to receive very consistent instruction. So in terms of the magnitude of that, when you look at standardized assessments of reading that are used throughout the country in grades 3 through 8, what we're seeing is a loss that's only equivalent to 1 or 2 percentile points compared to what children are expected would have learned and achieved if it hadn't been for the pandemic. The slightly larger loss seems to be happening mostly among 5th graders. So for those of you whose children have just finished 5th grade and are rising into 6th grade, that's something really for you to sort of keep in mind here this summer. What we are finding, though, is that the losses that are more concerning are in the area of mathematics, where those losses, depending on which study you look at, are running in general around 4 times greater than in reading, and for some grades even more than that. So if you look at some of those standardized assessments that are used throughout the country, those losses are showing up anywhere from about 7 to 11 percentile points compared to what the kids would have expected to have learned and achieved if it wasn't for the pandemic. And again, here, what we see is in looking at these assessments, grades 3 through 8, that the areas of the biggest loss are in grades 4, 5, and 6. So that can be reassuring for some parents and maybe a little more concerning for those whose kids are in those grades. What I would generally say, and we will return to this at the end as well, is that what we really want to do is to help our children come back to school next fall ready to love learning. So let's be careful about too much drilling or worksheets over the summer, and instead really looking at ways to really engage them in really fun, creative ways that they enjoy and that you can do together as a family. So we can go on to our next slide. The impacts, though, are not only academic. It's also about their emotional, their social, their physical development, and the impact on the whole family. And so tonight we're going to hear from some experts, all of whom live or work in Pittsford, who are members of our community, who are going to share with us some of their insights into how we as parents can help our children over the summer so that they're ready to return to school in September, eager and energized and ready to learn. I do want to note, though, that while most of our panel tonight is going to focus on children, it's also important that we don't forget about ourselves. I know when I was young, or I'm sorry, when my son was young, I quickly got frustrated with a lot of the parenting books I read, because even though they had lots of good tips, they were really focused on what to do with him and how to manage his behavior. But a lot of times as parents, our struggles aren't so much with our kids as they are with our own stress, our own behaviors, our own feelings about the situation. And sometimes what we need isn't another book to read, but it's a friend to turn to and who understands. And sometimes we just need a break from the responsibilities of parenting. So tonight is also about us as parents and making sure that we are all ready to support one another as a community. So as we hear from our panelists who we're now going to turn to, just a reminder, if you have questions, if you have things that you would like to hear them talk about more, please put it into the chat. After we've heard from all of the panelists, we will then turn to open with some questions, answers, and further discussion. But I'd like to start with our next slide here of thinking about physical health. And what is the COVID situation in the area for our kids right now? How can your child's pediatrician be a resource to you and a partner with you? So I'm very happy to be able to turn this over to Dr. L.J. Shipley. She's a pediatrician at Golisano Children's Hospital, and she's also a Pittsford parent. She has a rising sophomore, and she has a freshly minted graduate of Sutherland who will be heading off to the University of North Carolina in the fall. So I have the pleasure of working with LJ in my job at ROC the Future. And I always really appreciate learning from her, not only her experiences as a pediatrician, but the insight she brings as a mom as well. So we will turn it over to LJ.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your kind words. It's really an honor to be here with the rest of the team to talk with you this evening. And as Stephanie mentioned, I'm part of the leadership team now at Golisano Children's Hospital, but I was a primary care pediatrician at Panorama Pediatric Group for over 20 years. And so I feel like a primary care doc really is what I am. And I've just been engaged in other things, particularly during the pandemic. One thing I don't know if folks are aware is that during the pandemic, there were a number of collaborative groups that came together immediately and very quickly. Pediatricians and family physicians and nurse practitioners and nurses and behavioral health specialists and schools, educators and administrators and school nurses who have worked behind the scenes in a number of different collaborative structures, but trying to make sure that we're using the best information we can at all times to inform what was happening for kids in our community and for their families, and specifically trying to help keep things safe for children so that they could come back to school, to whatever form of in-person school we were able to do around the community. So I'm going to take some time without any slides. So you're going to get to see this information beside me here. And the hashtag PedsRock for Kids is actually one of the names of one of the collaborative teams that came together that did not exist prior to the pandemic. I want to give you a few things. I want to talk to you for a bit about what COVID is right now and what we're kind of looking towards for the fall, what you might be able to expect and what we don't know at this point. And then sort of transition. I have a couple of kind of big take home points I'd like to talk about, and then transition into the conversation about social emotional well-being for our kids. So bottom line, COVID rates have continued to drop in this last month and over the end of the spring and into the early summer. But there are still cases in unvaccinated adults and children. And so, I think this is really important to give credit that this is evidence of what kind of immunity you can achieve through vaccination, and what a very long year of following public health guidance can bring in terms of dropping rates. We don't know if these low rates will continue as we move into the fall and winter next year. And this has been the thing with COVID, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of monitoring that needs to happen and a lot of information sharing as it becomes available. That's really important. Knowledge is power. I say that all the time. We want to make sure that families and our community have as much knowledge as we do in the medical profession about what's coming or what we need to prepare for. So I think the thing that we don't know about really is the impact of these new variants, and particularly the Delta variant, which you'll see a lot of information. There's been all sorts of information in the news just over the last few days about cases of the Delta variant in certain areas of our country hitting about 20% of cases. This is more contagious, more likely to have more serious illness, but particularly in unvaccinated adults and children. And it may lead to more rising rates in the US as it has in other countries. And that's particularly for places where vaccinations are low. And so I think it's just important to note viruses mutate, they change, there are variants, this is what they do. And so this continues unless you can stop the spread of infection, and you stop the spread of infection through groups, through vaccine. And that's why it really is so important that we try to vaccinate as many people as possible to be able to basically stop this in its tracks. So I think that my big take home point is it has been longer than a year, and since last May, where we've been faced with things that are very much out of our control. And this is something that we can have control over. And so I really just want you to know that vaccination of adults and children ages 12 and up is just so important and very strongly encouraged, recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Family Practitioners, all of our specialists at Golisano Children's, and our primary care teams. And so We also know that people have questions about vaccines, though, right? And it has made some families be hesitant about vaccination for themselves or vaccination for their children who are eligible. And so for families who are unsure, we really want to encourage you to talk to your primary care pediatrician or your family physician. And we also want you to know that unlike earlier when vaccines first became available, now a majority of our primary care practices here are actually able to offer COVID vaccination for children ages 12 and up, and also in some instances for their caregivers or parents or family members. And so I just think that having a chance to talk to a trusted person in your family's life who's guiding you on other medical decisions is a valuable thing. So don't hesitate to reach out to your healthcare team if you have questions about this. The other thing I just want to make sure you know is that we do not know yet when COVID vaccination for children under the age of 12 will be approved. There's all sorts of conversation that it might occur in the fall, but we really don't know at this point. I think the other thing that we cannot know or predict yet, we had a lot of questions about what's it going to look like in the fall? Are we still going to have to do the symptom screening? Are we still going to need to have our kids be tested if they develop symptoms that could be consistent with COVID? What's it going to look like in school? And I just have to say to you that we really rely on the recommendations and the guidance from the CDC and New York State. And we don't know yet what that is going to look like, but we all agree with the commitment of our district and other school districts around the area to return to students to full in-person learning. And so we will know much more about those processes regarding symptom screening, testing, any mitigation strategies like masking and distancing. We'll know that stuff in the later summer before school begins. And the same teams that have been meeting throughout the pandemic are continuing to meet on a regular basis now to be prepared. And these meetings happen with our county health departments so that we're all on the same page. None of the guidance currently has changed. There's been some sort of misreports at times that guidance has changed, but it hasn't yet at this point. So I think that in the meantime, though, from a health standpoint, I just want to remind folks that masking for unvaccinated adults and children over age 2 is recommended when indoors. And we really encourage parents to remain attentive still to the symptoms that could indicate COVID infection and to seek assessment from your healthcare provider. So switching gears a little bit, from a social emotional standpoint, we know that children are very resilient. We talk about resiliency a lot, but the unprecedented isolation and stress, the loss of adult and peer contact and supports that come through school and other family and community engagement, all of that happened at the height of the pandemic really has led to significant anxiety, increasing rates of depression, trauma, stress, and it has had some negative developmental and educational impact for our children. Thank you, Stephanie, for summarizing how that really looks. But this is true for our very youngest children right on up through our older teens. And so tonight you are so fortunate. I've had a chance to preview the slides that are coming and know the experts who are on this call, but you're going to hear from experts on this panel about various approaches and actions you can take to support your own children now and really help promote their social emotional health and well-being and their resiliency. And I'm going to give you, anybody who ever saw me in practice knows I always like to give people like 3 things that they could do for their child when we finish a visit. And so I like to think in that fashion. And I'm going to give you my top 3. You'll hear way more from the other experts. The first one is about time. Spend fun, creative, and unstructured time with your kids. It doesn't have to be long time. I know everybody is working and busy, but playing games, exploring the outdoors, reading together. Make time also for reflective opportunities to check in and see how they're feeling. How they're feeling about themselves, their relationships with their friends, and their feelings about school. And then allow your child to give back. Encourage opportunities for volunteering, even for the youngest kids, even if it's just helping someone in your neighborhood. One of the best things for children and teens is to feel like they are contributing to their world and that what they do is meaningful for someone else. And that is just so important at a time when we've been much more focused on ourselves and isolated. And my last thing is, you can promote your child's resiliency by fostering relationships they have with other trusted adults that are outside of your immediate family, grandparents and aunts and uncles and teachers and coaches and neighbors. One of the things we absolutely know about resiliency is that it is these relationships with trusted adults, in addition to the relationship they have with you as a parent or a primary caregiver. It's those relationships with other trusted adults that foster resilience and are protective for our kids. And so my last point for you, I guess that's 4 as opposed to 3, but my last point is, if you are worried about how your child is doing, you're seeing disruptions in their mood, their sleep, their eating, I could go on, and you have you just don't feel things are right, please reach out to your primary care provider, your pediatrician, your family physician, your nurse practitioner, to discuss your concerns and engage them further in the assessment of what's happening for your child. And I wish you all well, and I get to transition, I think, to the next person on the panel. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, LJ. I absolutely love your 3 takeaways, and especially that emphasis on spending fun and creative and unstructured time. That is so important. So next, we're going to pick up on some of the stressors that LJ mentioned, and looking at stress and anxiety, and how can parents tell the difference between what is typical worrying that their child might feel versus anxiety. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Suzanne Luce from Pittsford Youth Services. I have the pleasure of working with the board of directors of PYS, and it is so clear to me that Suzanne really is a leader in the organization. She brings so many years of experience working with Pittsford youth and families, and really is going to be able to speak right now with a real emphasis on the elementary and middle school age. Although I know everything she shares really applies to all of us, no matter what our age is. So I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Stephanie. I was asked to talk to you tonight a little bit about ways to support your children when we're getting through the summer in anticipation of returning to school, and to look for different signs that parents can recognize to sort of separate the difference between worry and signs that you may need to look for some extra support because anxiety is present. Before we hit this slide, I'm going to just talk a little bit about some things that you can do to support your kids. And the number one thing, which so many of these you may think is common sense, but in the social work field, we are all about communication and talking about ways to help your children. So the number one thing is to really listen to them, not just to what they're saying, but to what they're not saying. If they're not talking about something at school that made them happy or something at school that was interesting to them, ask questions. It's always important to check in with your child and to see if they're okay. Sometimes as parents, we assume they're not complaining of anything, they must be fine, but it's really important to check in and ask. Ask those words, how are you doing? Is there anything that you're concerned about? You can do this with as young as kindergartners in first grade, all the way up, into the high school, and even your kids that are older. Sometimes kids' behaviors may tell or show us things that their words do not. Sometimes your child may tell you that they're feeling okay, but you're noticing maybe they're kind of picking at their dinner or not eating. They may not be sleeping well. They may be acting up and being more disruptive than normal, or the exact opposite, and they may present as really sullen or quiet. And those are some other signs that you as a parent want to also be on the lookout for, that there may be something more that's going on than what you may think. So we like to remind parents to really look at what the signs are, but also to look at what the signs aren't. The other important thing to remember is that kids need to feel validated and heard, even if they tell you, I don't want to talk to you, if you can sit with them and say, okay, I'll just sit with you and we'll just chill for a little bit, and then we'll see if we can have a conversation in a few minutes. Sometimes kids really need just that space to kind of get their thoughts together. You want to acknowledge what they're saying and what they're experiencing. Something as simple as, I hear you, when they tell you so-and-so at school today didn't talk to me, or nobody wanted to sit with me at lunch, or in the COVID world, somebody took their mask off and didn't listen to the teacher when they put it back on. So instead of assuming what your child is saying, to say, what was that like for you? You want to try and ask open-ended questions to engage your child in conversation and communication. The next thing that we always remind parents to do is to reflect or reframe what they're saying to you back to them. So for instance, you could say, I see you get really quiet when you're talking about your friend Joey, or I see that your head goes down whenever I bring up math. So those are all signs that they're worried about something, or something may be going on. And rather than asking, are you feeling this way? Sometimes it's more helpful to reflect back to them what you're seeing. I can see that you're worried. Never discount what your kids are saying or what they're worried about. Sometimes kids in the morning, for instance, may say, I have a really bad stomach ache, I don't want to go to school. And in the hurry to kind of get things moving to start the day, we may say, you're fine, just get on the bus. What I'm asking you to do, and what we in the clinical world feel is really helpful, is to say, instead of you're fine, don't worry, to say, seems like something's going on. Sometimes that will take less time than it will for the argument that's going to ensue about them getting on the bus. The other thing that you want to try to do is help your children to develop coping strategies. And what I like to do with the younger kids is instead of using the word strategies, I will use the word game plan. So whether your child is interested in music or sports or academics, they sort of always know how to get from A to B. So in sports, if you're a shortstop, the ball gets hit to you, you know where you know ahead of time where you're going to throw that ball. If you're going to throw it to second base or to first base or to home. So much like anxiety and worries, you need to help your child develop strategies of what to do when those things hit. So you can use the terminology strategies, you can use toolbox, you can use game plan, but it's really helpful to help them to figure it out. And it's a parent's natural instinct to try and fix things for our kids, but it actually really helps more if you help them to figure stuff out, because they feel empowered, they feel invested. Even though you know what your end result is, you want to try and engage them in the process of the conversation to get to that end result. So to recap, listening, checking in, validating or acknowledging where your child is at, reframing or reflecting what you're hearing back to them, and then developing a game plan or some strategies are really good ways that you can support your child as you're moving through the summer, getting ready for the anticipation of what may be coming in September. You may hear some more about some of these things from other speakers, and I know LJ spoke a little bit about some of them as well, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really just listen, not to just what they're saying, but what their behavior is showing you and what their words are not telling you. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the difference between worry and anxiety. You can go ahead and show the next slide. When kids worry, it's a part of anxiety, but it isn't the same thing as anxiety. Everybody lives with worry. And it's interesting because in working with the younger kids in the elementary school and in the middle school, what I've kind of come up with is this interesting metaphor that a worry is something that comes into your head, kind of moves around in there, but then it leaves. It might come back, but it never stays for long. What anxiety does is it comes into your head, it pitches the tent, it builds the campfire, it puts the chairs around the campfire, it's got the marshmallows and the chocolate and the graham crackers, and it wants to stay there. It doesn't want to leave. And so what I try to tell kids is we've got to figure out some ways to put the fire out, to pack the chairs up, to take the tent down and get it out of your head. And that is a very visual example that the kids really seem to buy into. And when they'll come back to the next session, they'll say, well, I got one of the chairs down, Mrs. Luce. The other ones are still there, but I got one out of my head. And then we'll talk about how were you able to do that? What was helpful? With kids, they get into this worry spiral, which is when the what ifs start coming. Well, what if this happens? And then this, and then this. And that starts to spiral down. And the best thing that you can do as a parent to stop that spiral is to communicate assurance to them. You can ask questions and things like, well, what went well today? Kids like to focus on what didn't go well. We want to try and shift that focus to what went well, excuse me. What did you do when you felt like that? What helped you? Again, we as parents want to tell kids what helps, but oftentimes what we as adults think of are different things than what our kids are coming up with. So it's really important to listen to where they're at and to ask these really open-ended questions that allow them to respond back to you versus you telling them and them agreeing with you. Oftentimes with worry and anxiety, it's what you can control versus what you can't control. So if you can help your kid use some rational thinking or some logical thinking, their worries may not seem rational or logical to you. You know there's no monsters under the bed for a young child, but a young child feels that. So to say they're not there isn't going to discount that fear that they have in their head. You really need to listen to them and go back and ask the questions like, what is likely to happen if this worry that you're having happens? What's a more likely outcome? So if you can help them to see the difference between what's real and what's perceived as real, that often can stop that worry spiral. Worry is something that we all do. It's a natural part of life. And it's something that leads to thoughts that you can usually keep in perspective. What anxiety is, it makes you think of worst case scenarios. It's hard to get out of that. Again, the tent is pitched, the fire's lit, it's living in your head. And our job as parents and as helpers is to help the kids not say, don't worry about that, but to figure out a way that they can be in control of that. And then there's some very concrete things that you can do to help ground a child in a moment, to get them out of that spiral, and then to help them to move forward. Another big difference between worry and anxiety is real events cause worry, but the mind is something that creates the anxiety. Worry comes and goes, sort of like it fluctuates, but anxiety sticks around. Again, I'm going to reiterate the metaphor of the campground in your head. It sticks around and it tends to affect the quality of life that your child is living. It'll show in the classroom, it'll show at home. Sometimes they want to do things, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can use words to tell you what they're feeling. Sometimes their behavior tells you. Worry can be really productive because it helps kids to generate solutions to real life problems. And that's where parents come in, because you can talk with their child and sort of help them figure out how to get rid of that worry. Anxiety can be debilitating, and it can be an intense, and it can be really persistent. So if you need or want support or help, there are, as LJ said, we always encourage families to talk to their pediatrician. You can certainly reach out to your school counselor or your school social worker. We can all do referrals out to community support agencies like Strong Behavioral Health or Genesee Mental Health, and there's lots of private therapists out there to help you as well. I'm going to pass it back to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was, I really love that tent metaphor. And, you know, just sort of helping kids be able to think through what's the evidence for that worry or anxiety, and, you know, to think beyond just the worst case scenario. In addition to sort of this emotional aspect of, if we can go on to the next slide, there's also impacts on social development and social skills. Children of all ages, regardless of how much they have been in school in person, have really missed out on a lot of the normal play and the normal recreation. And that is critical, because that is where they build a lot of these important skills, like sharing, taking turns, empathy, setting goals, planning, working in groups. And the summer is an especially great time where they can develop some of those skills again, or strengthen them through a lot of fun activities and really help to grow in their confidence socially and in their skills emotionally. So to give us some insights into how we can support the social and emotional growth, we are joined tonight by Elizabeth Devaney, who is another Pittsford parent and who also works at the Children's Institute with the Whole Child Connection. So I will turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Stephanie. Really glad to be here. I have 3 kids at Calkins and Allen Creek, so it's really fun to be able to come talk as part of the community. So I'm really here to focus on kind of resilience and readiness and thinking about moving forward and sort of how to approach mindset and impact of all of this on overall well-being. So the first thing I want to note and just kind of highlight is what LJ talked about, is that we don't really know entirely what's coming next. So we have a pretty good idea, but we're still living in that state of uncertainty a little bit. And also in a state where really people's mindsets and opinions and their comfort and well-being are really wildly divergent. So I think it's important to recognize the fact that we don't all feel the same way about this. So when we're thinking about social interactions and communicating with others, we're just all in really different places. And so it's important to recognize that. And we've been in this state of kind of prolonged crisis and uncertainty. And even though we may be feeling good right now as things are starting to open up and rules are starting to relax, and there's some sense that, okay, this thing's over, there's still this sort of uncertainty, and it doesn't mean we haven't had this lasting impact. So I wanted to start, and you can go to the next slide, with really talking about you as a parent, and recognizing that you can't really support your children's well-being until you really explore your own well-being. So I want to encourage you to kind of ask yourself some of these questions as a starting point, really exploring your own sense of well-being. So how have you changed? If you think about it, think about how are you different? How is your family different? So for many people, jobs have changed. Some people are now permanently working from home. I know people have put their careers on hold. Some families have been working in this fully remote state for over a year, and that's a really long time to be in such a different state of being. I know families that have changed the way they're doing their vacations or their family traditions. And many, many people have talked about really kind of deciding that they didn't like the busyness of pre-pandemic life and really want to kind of hold on to some of the things that they've changed in their lives. So ask yourself that, what have you changed and what are you wanting to hold on to? What's different for you? And then really decide what you're comfortable with and be very clear with yourself and your family about that. So you may need time to emerge from kind of this pandemic life. Introverts are really feeling the shift a lot differently than extroverts, for example. So for many introverts, having permission to kind of remove yourself from social interactions was really freeing and comforting. And now this feeling of, okay, I have to come back into this, I'm not ready, is stressful. And so being aware of that for yourself is really important, and giving yourself permission to kind of name what you might be feeling. It's also helpful to think about all the people in your household and consider whether you're on the same page as your children, your spouse or partner, and your social groups. So you may have shifted, but your spouse or your kids may not have. You might be kind of happier about the quieter lifestyle, like I said, but your kids can't wait to get out and get back to social gatherings. Your spouse may be saying, hey, let's go out to dinner, and you're not ready for it. Or, you might be itching to get out shopping with your teenage daughter. That might be something you used to do together, go to the mall. And now your daughter just wants to shop online because she's not comfortable with it anymore. So, you kind of have to think about where each person in your household is and what they're feeling ready for, what they're comfortable with, as they begin to kind of emerge out of this very long year of uncertainty and kind of the social distancing. And so taking some time to think about how are you going to care for yourself. And we've all heard a million times, you need to sleep and eat well and meditate and do all these things. So I'm not talking necessarily about that kind of baseline self-care, but really considering some of these questions about what you want and what you need and how you can kind of ease back into what you had before. So, as an example, if you or someone in your household is returning to the office after, time at home, think of that as sort of an occasion, an event, something that's going to take some time. Or if you're starting to plan, I know lots of people have been planning graduation parties, or I've heard about weddings are coming back, and people are able to have those. Really think about what that is going to be like for you, for your kids, for your family, and try and resist the pressure to do it like everyone else is doing it, because this has been a very unique situation for everyone. People are experiencing it really differently. So take the time to think about what you need to take care of yourself as things begin to shift. And that's going to help you be better able to take care of your kids. So if you go to the next slide, after you have time, ask these questions of yourself, I think then you can really start thinking about your kids. And so Suzanne and LJ talked about this a little bit, but what to expect from your kids. And I would say really just expect anything, because that's going to be a theme for me. Everybody's different, everybody's experiences are different. So some kids are super excited about returning to normal, right? They want to get out and see their friends. They can't wait till school year next year is going to be normal, all of that. And some kids are very anxious about returning to normal and don't want to go back. They've been very comfortable at home. Some of that might look like indifference or disinterest or withdrawing. So kids may be saying no, when you say, hey, you want to think about a camp? Do you want to do this activity? Should we go to a movie? How about we go out to dinner? You want to invite a friend over? You might be hearing some, no thanks. Not being excited about some of the things they used to be excited about. And it's hard to distinguish between where there's sort of depression and where this might just be a little bit of that kind of easing back in, trying to get comfortable with things again. So, as Suzanne and LJ said, if you're really worried, certainly talk to your pediatrician, but also start to ask yourself some of these questions about where your child might be on the spectrum of kind of feeling comfortable with things. There's going to be some concern that some kids are really going to be seeing the end of the school year as an end of COVID. There's this kind of stopping point where kids are saying, okay, it's summertime, school's over, we're done with that whole thing, and next year is going to be 100% like it used to be. And we still don't know what it's going to be, as LJ was talking about. And so we really need to kind of help set some expectations for kids, help them think about, what that might look like, or just say, without making them too uncomfortable and nervous, but make sure you're sort of introducing the fact that there's still a little uncertainty. Expect mistakes and mess ups. So some kids are going to be bad at things they used to be good at. We saw that with academics. Really good students were struggling this year. But you may see struggling with social skills, some of those day-to-day chores and activities. I guarantee you kids are going to miss their alarms. They're going to forget homework. They're going to miss the bus. There's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff going on next year because they're really getting used to the new old schedule, right? They're going to be getting back to some of those things that they haven't done for a long time. And we really need to expect that there's going to be some mistakes in there. I want to talk a little bit about this loss or change in social skills. And I highlighted the or because I think for many kids, they've had to learn to really socialize differently this year. And I've talked to a lot of kids who it really upsets them when adults tell them they aren't socializing or they don't know how to interact with people. They're actually navigating this incredibly complex social infrastructure that most of us adults have never had to deal with. Social media and virtual communication were already a whole different ballgame. And then this year has just kind of anteed that up. So for many kids, they are socializing, but it looks really different than what we're comfortable with. And it looks really different than even what they were used to. But it's still happening to some degree. So I think it's trying to recognize and understand what those social interactions are looking like. And then there's going to be kids who are doing great and really weathered the year in generally good spirits. They're ready to move on. They're pretty resilient. And if your kid falls into that category, that's fantastic. You don't need to force them to have concerns if they really aren't there. But again, asking those questions and kind of keeping an eye out for what they aren't saying is really important. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about was what are some of the things we can do this summer to help get our kids ready for next school year, just in terms of kind of their social emotional well-being. So one of the things I would recommend is really trying to mirror your child's pace. So it might be different for every kid in your house if you have multiple children. It certainly is in my house. But, you know, recognizing that some kids are ready to be back at it. They want to plan social gatherings. They really want to get together with their friends. They can't wait to go to Seabreeze. You know, they're out and about. This thing is over and they are excited. And then, you know, just like adults, there are going to be some who are feeling really differently. They may not feel that way. They may be nervous. They may be feeling worried about taking their mask off. They may still have anxiety about getting sick. So really observing and following their lead is important. But creating some opportunities for social interaction is going to be important to get them used to it if they really haven't been interacting with other kids this year, in a way that fits your child. So again, you know, don't plan a big party or sign up for camps, a million camps, if that's not going to be what your child needs. Maybe start with a one-to-one play date. Keep it short for younger kids, maybe just an hour, maybe 2 hours. Have, you know, if you have a pool, have a friend over to swim where they can feel pretty comfortable if they feel some nerves about COVID, or, you know, have parents there. So it's just pretty, you know, small interactions. Don't start off with a sleepover. And then, you know, begin to ease into longer play dates, or maybe something with a couple of kids, you know, maybe go somewhere that they've always liked going. Try and be aware of what your child needs, and then try and build the interactions around that, and sort of practicing over the summer to get ready for next year. I'm not going to talk about the questions. Suzanne already talked about how important it is to ask questions and listen more than you talk. So, you know, just zip it is really my main advice, and just ask a question and learn to love the long pauses. And look for those moments. For me, bedtime is the best time to try and bring up conversations with my kids. You know, some people like card drives. There's lots of times, but just think about those moments where you're most likely to get your child to start talking. I wrote here creating scenarios and role plays and practice. So this won't work for all kids. Some are not going to be into it, but there are some kids who this can be really helpful for, to think about some scenarios that they're worried about and actually practice and walk through it. So that can help with that worst case scenario thinking that Suzanne was talking about. But, you know, for the classic example is the lunch table, right? For some kids, like the 6th graders and the 9th graders and the kindergartners, they haven't experienced the lunchroom yet in their new school. And that can be very stress inducing, especially for kids who are more shy. It's sort of, what do I do? How am I going to walk into the lunchroom? Where do I sit? Who do I sit with? So just walking them through that. What might you do? You know, who could you ask and invite to come sit down with you? You know, those kinds of things. You know, actually walking through a script with them. And it may feel a little silly, but sometimes that role playing and practicing can really help calm and ease somebody's mind, a child's mind, if they feel like they have a plan in place. So I would really recommend some practicing over the summer. Have fun. That was one of LJ's number one summary items. My kids the other day created a summer bucket list, and I thought it was such a great idea. I told them I was going to put it in the PowerPoint for tonight. It was fun for them to be hopeful and optimistic and think about some of the things that we couldn't do last summer. So we couldn't go to Seabreeze last summer, and we do that every summer. So that's on their bucket list. But then there were also little things like getting a milkshake at the dairy, or going to the beach, things that, you know, just that mean summer to them, that make them feel excited and happy and optimistic. So for your kids, there'll be different things on your bucket list, but think about ways to have fun this summer. And then the last two, just quickly, lowering your expectations and planning on a long transition. So again, this isn't the time to go hire tutors and get back into as many activities as possible to catch up on what you missed out on and what your kids are missing out on. Expect this to take some time and allow them that time. We went through a collective trauma as a community, as a nation, as a world, and that's going to take a long time to get over. And even if your kids seem to fare pretty well, it was still essentially a trauma. And so it will take major adjustment. So give your kids time to really make that change. Think of it as kind of something that's going to be a process and take some time. So I think that is it for me. I'm going to turn it back to Stephanie now.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I really love that there is this repeated theme of making sure our kids have fun this summer. Again, I can't tell you enough as a psychologist how much we know that kids learn through play. And this is the time to play together as a family, to find those opportunities for them to play together safely with their friends. So finally, tonight, our last presentation is going to be focusing a little more on the return to school in September, how you can help your child get off to a great start, and thinking about it a little more for the older kids. So we are going to turn now to Dave Pascarella, who is a social worker at Sutherland High School, and to Katie McGowan, a behavior specialist in the school district. And we will hear from them. And as they are talking, again, just a reminder, if there are things you want to hear more about or questions that you want us to try to address, you can go ahead and start putting those in the chat, because then we will move to the Q&A portion after Katie and Dave go.
Okay, I think if we can go to the next slide.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to use sort of an example somewhere in here. I encourage parents to talk with their kids about how they've experienced the COVID and the pandemic. So I will share with you all that this is driving me crazy. I can't see anybody's face. And there's all these people on the other side of this screen. And I talk with my hands, and I'm trapped in this little box. So just to sort of share with you some of my frustration with the pandemic and how I've been experiencing it, and it's okay to share with your kids about things that you've experienced. I find the kids I work with, it helps me to get them to open up a little bit when I share some of the struggles that I've had with it. But to piggyback on some of the other things that have been said, you know, I really encourage parents to talk to their kids. Again, using that reflective listening. And the best way to do this is to avoid those closed-ended questions. So any question that could be answered with a simple yes or no, you want to try to avoid that to the best you can. So instead, use an open-ended question. Whenever it comes to talking about difficult things, I like the sandwich technique. So you start with something positive, then you get into the nitty-gritty, and then you end with something positive. So what I would encourage to do is start a we got the cart before the horse. Can we go to the next slide and then go back to this one? Okay, so some positive questions. You want to avoid emotionally charged language. So things like, you know, try to avoid words like anxious and scared, and try to use more neutral words. So for the positive questions, you know, what are you most looking forward to about next year? What do you think will be good about next year? What friends do you look forward to seeing? In the high school, you know, half the kids were there on Tuesday, Thursday, the other, or Monday, Thursday, then Tuesday, Friday. So it's good to say, you know, which of the kids in the different parts of the alphabet are you looking forward to seeing? What friends do you hope are in your classes? You can ask questions to what teachers do you hope you'll get? And then getting into the more difficult things to think about, you know, what do you predict might be hard about school next year? What do you think the biggest challenge will be? What are you most worried about? Another thing to do with it works with all kids, older kids. I'd say middle school to upper high school. You could say, you know, what do you think your friends are worried about? So if you have a kid that doesn't like to talk about themselves, you can say, what do you think your friends are worried about? And then closing it back with the positive questions, you know, what have your friends said they're looking forward to? What clubs, sports do you think you'll be interested in? Which teachers are you looking forward to seeing? So that is a way to engage those questions. And I like what Elizabeth was saying, you know your kids best. So when are the best times to introduce those questions, or maybe being open for them presenting themselves the opportunity to have that discussion. And then if we can go back to the previous slide. Thank you. Yeah. So then down towards the bottom, keep the discussion going after school starts. So when school starts back, what's been good about school so far? What's been different? Has anything surprised you? What has been bad, disappointing, not awesome? Those kinds of things. And again, share, if you've been working remote and had to go back to work, or you could also share if you were their age, how would you be experiencing these kinds of things? What would have been hard for you? Like I share with my kids, that I work with, that I would really have struggled being an ADHD person. Working at home would have been a huge struggle for me. So letting them know that they're not alone in this. And I didn't really introduce myself. I apologize. I'm Dave Pascarella. I'm the school social worker at Sutherland High School. So if any of your kids are coming over to Sutherland, feel free to shoot me an email, or we could talk. And I think that was mostly for my stuff. So if we can go to the next slide, then I believe Katie's going to take it after this.
Can we skip forward one more slide? Hi, I'm Katie McGowan. I'm the behavior specialist. I am split between the two secondary buildings. So at Mendon and Sutherland, I spend my time between both. One of the things that you've kind of heard throughout this entire presentation is being present and being consistent for your kids, letting them know that you're there as a support. What we know about what's coming is that it's going to be a huge transition. Whatever it's going to look like, we know that there is going to be a big transition, and we don't know necessarily what it's going to look like. So when we start thinking about that, how do we build the stamina and endurance of our students preparing for the fall, right? So being in the secondary building, I think about this hybrid model, right? This 2 days in person, 3 days remote. And a lot of kids that I've talked to have said, I don't want to go back to 5 days a week. I think it'll be exhausting. And I think that's true for a lot of kids, that 5 days a week, the rigor of that is going to be really hard. So we need to set some realistic expectations about what that's going to look like when we return. We can't expect it all to happen at once, right? This is going to be a transition that has to happen over time in collaboration with families and schools. And how do we work together to support our students as they transition back in the fall? One of the things that can be helpful as we're planning for this is starting to establish routines prior to the start of school. And now when I say routines, there are the common ones that come to mind, right? Sleep schedule, meal times, things that sometimes can get a little loose during the summer, thinking about as we're getting ready to return, tightening up some of that. But those aren't the only kind of routines that we're talking about. Establishing routines around fun, those times to connect with your child, those are key parts of showing your child that you're there, present, and ready to support them. And routines are great because they're predictable, right? They make us feel safe. We know what to expect and what's coming. So that kids thrive when they know what those routines are. So, have kids provide input about what they need. And, it can be communicated in a variety of ways across a variety of age groups. But when kids are invested in what their days look like, what some of that conversation can be around, it's just such a powerful thing when we can provide kids with that, when we can provide them with choices about what their days look like. I think it's such a wonderful thing to be able to do. So when I say routines, I do think about sleep schedules and meal times and all of those things, but what other fun and enriching routines can you build into your day? I loved the example given earlier about volunteering, ways to give back to your community, making that part of your weekly routine. Those are phenomenal opportunities to be with your child, have something that is fun and enriching as part of their day. The second part I want to touch on a little bit is lead with compassion, warmth, and calm. And I think it's also important to recognize how trying this year has been for all of us, right? So we're all doing the best we can, and thinking about the self-care component, of how do we provide this for our students and children as well, when we are also struggling to find our new normal, right? And what all these transitions mean for us. So I say this, but it's really about how do we work together with our kids, and how do we work together with our school team to provide our children the support they need. Children need stability during this time of change. And I know that Suzanne talked about it a little bit earlier, that kids' reactions might look different, right? So these might be signs that we see. It's about what they're not saying. So they may be a little snippier than usual. It could be an indicator of stress, overreacting to seemingly small things. So how do we attend to those things and provide support? You know your child better than anyone. So just being aware of what's occurring is one way we can help support our students in moving forward, recognizing and then fostering that communication and conversation that's been mentioned earlier by a variety of presenters. Listening. How do we actively listen to what our students are saying, and how do we give them what they need and work with them to support both emotionally and academically moving forward? One of the things that I think is incredibly important is how do we model what we want to see from the kids? Our kids attend to everything that we're doing. I think about those nonverbal cues that we provide all the time. My mom had a look, and it wasn't always a conscious look, but when she gave that look, I immediately knew what was the expected behavior. So, trying to attend to what our body language may be telling our kids, and how do we model how we want them to respond to those challenging times, I think is really important. So thinking about the tone of voice you're presenting it in, how do we frame this so that it's more of a positive exposure and preparing them for things that might happen, instead of this cautious tone that may inspire some uncertainty or fear in our students. So thinking about how do we structure this and model what we want to see from our kids is a critical piece. So it's one of the ways that we can provide support, is modeling what we want to see from them. So I think if we go to the next slide, this is a reiteration of what Suzanne had said earlier, talking about listening, validating, and then how do we help problem solve and walk our kids through it? Because again, our natural inclination is to try to fix, right? Try to make better. So how do we collaborate with our kids to give them the tools they need when they face adversity in the future? And one of the things that comes up with validation when I talk about it across the board is it communicates acceptance of the feeling. If there's an action that we're not happy with, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are accepting of that action. So I just want to make sure that we're validating the feeling and moving forward in that way. So I just really put down the steps that Suzanne mentioned earlier. So it might be a nice resource for you. Reflect the content, acknowledge and reflect the emotion that they are communicating, accept that emotion. I can see why you'd feel that way. And then follow up with curious questions that will help prompt them into that further conversation about, okay, this is where we are now. How do we move forward from here? So I think it's just a really great resource for families to have this kind of step-by-step broken down for them to move forward. So that is all I have for tonight. So I'll hand it back to Stephanie.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave and Katie. And I really appreciate, the fact that you're both here tonight, and the parents can reach out to you, especially for those whose kids are rising ninth graders, who you may be seeing in the fall. So I just want to wrap up with a couple of comments, and then we will open it up to some questions for anyone on the panel. We have heard so many important insights and practical tips from our panelists. And just want to remind again that as we move into summer, remember that our children, no matter their age, learn everywhere, not only in school. And there may be specific skills that your child's teacher wants them to work on over the summer, but don't lose sight of the fact that children learn through play, and teenagers especially as well learn by engaging in the world around them. So whether you are having a family game night, cooking dinner, doing home improvement projects together, traveling, engaging with our children this summer, helping them explore new places, have new experiences, develop some practical skills, and build relationships will help them to come back to school in September excited, re-energized, and ready to learn. Finally, I do want to just add one little note. As someone who worked a number of years as a high school guidance counselor and who has been on faculty at the college level, I do also want to especially remind that those parents of high school students who might be a little bit concerned, especially if their grades were less than stellar this year, that the entire nation has gone through this. And the college admissions staff are very well aware that this year's grades may not reflect everything your child is capable of. And they are going to take that into account when your child goes to apply those to those colleges. So for those parents who are a little worried about that, I know I've been having conversations with quite a few parents over the last couple of weeks about it, that you just take a deep breath and know that there is always going to be an asterisk by this school year, and everyone will know what that means, and everyone is going to take that into account. So a few tips here, just for you to look at that, sort of again, really emphasize that there's a lot that we can do with our children this year, this summer, having fun, that really can make a big difference for them. And finally, our last slide, just a little bit of a visual reminder from the last couple of weeks, that if you are concerned about your child, if you are stressed as a parent, we are a community and we are here for one another. So there are so many resources, whether it is reaching out to someone from your child's school, to Pittsford Youth Services, to your child's pediatrician. There are so many people who are here, as well as reaching out to your own friends, your own neighbors. We are here for one another, and we have been and will continue to be in this together. So at this point, we're done with the panel, and we do have a little bit of time here for questions or things that you would like to hear more from. So if you have things that you specifically want, either in general or to direct to anyone, you can put those in the chat. And meanwhile, I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and some of these are for particular panelists. Let me pull up my screen here. So there is one question that actually I can answer. Very pleased to be able to answer. A couple of parents have asked about sort of what the infection rates are right now in Pittsford, so that they can, sort of make good decisions as their children are socializing and getting together with other people. And I am so proud of our community. I really am. Our vaccination rate right now in Pittsford for people who are age 12 and older in the 14534 zip code is over 87%. And in the 14618 zip code is over 83%. So what this really means is that this summer, if your child is around people in Pittsford who are 12 and older, chances are those people have been vaccinated. So you can rest assured that our rates are extremely high. But that does raise one question that's coming in that I think really is a great question for LJ, which is just sort of because there are families, some people are vaccinated, younger children are not. Are there any just sort of practical tips or reassurances you can give about what the chances are of someone who's vaccinated transmitting to a younger child? You know, any thoughts on that in terms of as parents navigate this mixed situation that they may be in?
Thanks, Stephanie. It's a great question. It is one that there's all kinds of caveats with this, I guess. I think what's important to know is, especially during the summer where the weather is nicer, if you can be doing activities that are outside, that minimizes risk right there, just because it's in the open air, better ventilation. So I would prioritize outdoor activities for getting together in groups. That doesn't mean that you cannot do indoor activities. I think we have to trust that the people we're gathering with are being attentive to symptoms within their own family. That's a really important thing. I think if a family member has symptoms that, you know, could be suggestive of COVID, you know, that's probably a better time to not gather. And I do think that, you know, there are things that we really learned work, not that we didn't know they worked before, but they really work. Hand washing, hand sanitizer, being attentive to symptoms. And if you're concerned or you are worried or you have a family member who could be at more risk and you're definitely going to an indoor event, masking. It's terrific protection. So I think that we have not seen the same rates of spread among younger children, clearly. We know that from looking at daycare centers and, you know, early childhood learning communities. We also know that taking measures to protect against spread works super well with the school age kids and the older kids, right? That's why we did so well during the pandemic. We did not see spread within schools. We saw spread within groups of kids, but they tended to be at times where our infection rates were higher, and also in times where they were gathering indoors in groups and not following, you know, sort of the mediation protocols for masking or other things. So I think it's a matter of, you know, take advantage of the good weather in our area. And I think ask people to be honest about, you know, if someone's sick in their home. But I don't want people to feel limited, and yet at the same time want them to be, you know, smart and thoughtful about this. And I think be attentive to watch the, you know, don't watch the news every day. You don't have to, but, you know, be attentive to what's happening in terms of if there are changing rates or things start to change. Right now, our rates in our community are extraordinarily low. And Stephanie pointed out that in, you know, across the community, our vaccination rates are good. They're really excellent, as you pointed out in the Pittsford zip codes. And that's a positive. But the rates of transmissible infection right now are very low. Thanks,
Great.
Stephanie.
Thank you so much, LJ. I'm going to jump to a very different kind of question. I think this is a great one. Someone has written in that their first grader has gotten used to keeping their crayons, their glue stick, all that other stuff to themselves. So some of that sharing and turn taking, you know, they've not been doing this year in school. So I'd like to maybe turn to Elizabeth first. You might have some thoughts about sort of those sort of social and emotional skills, and what might be some tips for how to help kids who are, you know, just not in the habit that they would have been otherwise.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I guess in many ways, I think for parents, especially of the really youngest kids, is to sort of think of it almost like restarting school again in some ways. So when your kids started kindergarten, you kind of had to, and if they hadn't been in a preschool setting or, you know, even if they had, you sort of had to learn those things, talk through, okay, well, why do you want to hold on to it? How did you feel when, you know, you had to share your crayons? What are some, you know, isn't it fun to share your friend, you know, with your friends, sort of kind of going through those social skills again, talking through, same way we were talking about questions for older kids, really, you know, how does it make you feel? You know, what are some nice things about sharing? What do you like when your friends share with you? You know, some of those kinds of questions. And then practicing at play dates with smaller numbers of kids. So if you have friends over, have, you know, one person over and just practice doing some sharing and reminding them that it's okay. You can sort of figure out whether it's coming from being afraid of getting sick. Because I think we heard so much and kids heard so much that, oh, if you don't want to touch other people's things because you might get sick. So no, I think there's some fear of, oh, I can't touch anybody else's things. But then also, also just kind of, this is my stuff and I like my stuff, so you have to kind of figure out which thing it is and help them kind of talk through and just practice, a lot of practice.
Right. Great. Suzanne, did you want to add anything? I saw you nodding your head when Elizabeth was talking. Did you have some thoughts on that for the younger kids?
Yeah, I love what Elizabeth said, and I would just reiterate the advantage you have in preparation for September is you can practice and play with your kids, right? So let them have their crayons and pencils and you have yours, and practice by modeling. Could I use your blue crayon? No, that's mine. You're allowed to have that interaction with your child. You're the model for them. Well, gee, I don't have a blue. I would really like to use it. Do you want me to sanitize my hands before I touch your crayon? And then it can lead into conversations about, seems like you might be worried when you go back to school, if you allow somebody else to use it, that's going to cause a problem. What are you worried about? Again, it's having these conversations, but I love what Elizabeth said, practice it with your kid, practice it with your child, kind of get an understanding of where they're at. All elementary school K and first graders are going to all be in that same boat. Nobody's used to sharing. And believe me when I say the schools are well prepared on how to address that when school starts, because we know that it's coming.
Great. Flipping to sort of the older kids, I'm seeing quite a number of questions and concerns about sleep. And I know Katie had addressed that somewhat about sleep routines. So I just sort of wanted whoever would like to jump in first with this of what, and of course, sleep is always a challenge with teenagers anyway. So what would you share about what are good sleep habits, especially for teenagers, and what are maybe some ways for parents to help their kids navigate some of those expectations about when and how much they sleep? So whoever wants to jump in on that one, take it away.
I think Dave and I may have some paired access to that, but in terms of planning for sleep schedules and routines, having those conversations with your kids is critical. I also think there's an education piece about, what is expected, and honestly, do some experimenting with your child of like, all right, you're telling me that you can go to bed at this time and still be able to do what you need to do. Start having some of those conversations about what you need, because no two kids are alike necessarily within that sleep schedule piece. We just know that having some kind of routine is important. Honestly, many of my students, the biggest barrier for sleep routines is the phone. Being able to separate from that phone and have time to just rest and be away from the blue light of the phone. So almost some of the strategies around what is our phone use also is a big piece of that, because it definitely impacts a lot of our students. I mean, I've had students tell me I've been up until 3 a.m. because I was texting a friend or playing a video game. So structures and expectations around what that looks like, and some of that is teen appropriate, but how do we make sure that they're getting what they need? And they'll show us, and hopefully we can have that conversation, and we can tell them what we need and what they need also. Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that I was surprised by how many kids told me, like, your generation had it easy. You didn't have these phones. And I said, no, we didn't. When I got off out of school and off the school bus, that was it. You had a corded phone that you had to drag to the bathroom, shut the door, hope nobody clotheslined themselves over it. You could only talk to one person at a time. There was no real time. You didn't know what you missed out on until Monday. So absolutely. And they said so I would encourage parents to just have a rule in the house. All the devices get put in a bin, and we go to bed without our devices. Because even adults can't be trusted with that phone. Next thing you know, you're doing the whole doom scrolling, reading the news and stuff like that. And so, I really do recommend no matter how old the kid is, it's just force them to take a break from it. Because the feedback I was getting from the kids, they didn't come out and say that they wish their parents took the phone away, but it really did feel like they would appreciate somebody else having that control, because yeah, it does keep them up, and the video games too. So, and I get it, you know, I mean, I would be struggling if I was their age right now, but sometimes it's up to us to say, okay, you need to practice being without your phone right now.
Right.
Can I jump in also? One last thing, Stephanie. I also want to add that sometimes it's really good to point out and make the connection between how they function the next day when they went to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, or they were up all night talking to their friends because the phone was under their pillow. How did they function the next day? How did they feel the next day? And helping kids to see cause and effect. You know, middle school and high school age kids, that's so important to let them be a part of understanding it and not just the discipline part.
Absolutely. And I've got to tell you, like, you know, I think that's where parents can also support one another, because I love what you're saying, Dave. It's almost like kids are asking us to set those limits for them. That doesn't mean they're going to say like, thanks, mom, thanks, dad, for doing that. They may still complain about it, but, you know, in many ways they are asking for it. And many parents do that, you know, in some ways, if we can bond as parents and say, hey, I don't know about other people, but I know my 6 friends all have that rule in their house. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
And I think that to piggyback what Suzanne said, you could frame it as, hey, let's pilot something for this week. Let's just try an experiment in the house where everybody turns their phone in. That way it does feel like more of a partnership. And you can say, oh, did everybody sleep better? I slept better. You know, so yeah, I like the idea of partnering rather than just like, this is the rule of the house. So
I was going to suggest something along those lines, Dave. I think, you know, that on the iPhone, if your child is still connected to your account, you can set screen controls. And, you know, I know some parents are hesitant to do that because it feels like you're not trusting your kid. And so another way to kind of handle that trust question is to sort of say, hey, let's make a plan. Like, when do you think we should turn it off? What's a reasonable time? And they're not going to say 3 in the morning, you know, like, let's set your screen time to go off, you know, when you suggest, and we'll try it. We'll see how it goes. And, you know, do you want, like, let's put limits. What's a reasonable amount of time on TikTok? Like 2 hours, 3 hours? Like, what's a reasonable limit here? You know, when they look at it and they see 7 hours, they're like, oh my gosh, this is insane. But, you know, if you don't look at it and so you can kind of use that as a way to have a conversation, ask what they think is realistic or reasonable, and then try it. And then you can revisit and say, how did it go? Or, you know, things like that. So I agree that that kind of conversation can be really helpful.
That's great. I think we could talk so much longer. We are coming up on the end of our time, and I know our hosts have a little bit of wrapping up that they want to do, but I just want to thank, first off, all the parents who were here tonight, and all the parents who I know are going to be watching this later when they stream it. Again, a reminder, we are a community. We are in this together. We are there to support one another as parents, as professionals, and you and your kids aren't in this alone. So our kids are strong, they are resilient, and together we are going to have a great summer. And no matter what the school year brings, we're going to be ready to face it. And at the very least, I am hopeful and optimistic that it won't be exactly what it was this year. But thank you all, and I will turn it back over to Kim.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Stephanie. So I just want to thank everyone for participating tonight. As Stephanie mentioned, I know we will have a lot of people who will be catching up with this over the summer, which I think is amazing also that we can add this resource and put it out there and it lives on. So thank you so much for joining us. Before you hang up, I do have a poll I want to send out to all the people who are on the call live to ask about what you would like to see from programs for next year. So I'm going to stop the recording. I will also mention there were some questions in the chat about district-specific policies that I know that we don't have an answer for yet. So I've written those down. I'm going to submit them to the powers that be in our district. And as soon as we do have answers on things like masking policy in the fall, social distancing during lunch in the fall, as soon as those details are out, we will be sharing them, and the district will be sharing them. So I'm going to stop recording and send out the poll. So once again, thank you to everyone.